Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much to Sandra and the conference committee for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event. It's been a terrific program so far and really enjoying being here. The focus of my talk is on 10 key discoveries about language and literacy in the first 10 years of life and the policy and service implications. It's a compilation of study results, and we recently had the opportunity to present these results and discuss the implications to the Senate inquiry into communication disorders here in Australia. And the results that we presented were so similar to those of our colleagues at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne that the committee invited us to get together and put forward some of our key recommendations for changes to policy and the design of services for children with language impairment, which we happily did. So I just want to preview that the discoveries we've made really match those of our colleagues in Victoria, and these results really surprised us. We've learnt to live with them. They certainly throw up some challenges for policies and services, and I hope you enjoy the journey through these discoveries. My collaborators. Been asked to put the mic on, which I'll do. Haven't lost my way. My collaborators in this search for language patterns are Mabel Rice from the University of Kansas and colleagues from the Telethon Kids Institute, Steve Zubrick, Dan Christensen, David Lawrence, Francis Mitru, and Steve Ball. Oh, I'm going backwards. There we go. All right. Our economic and social policy dials in Australia are all set towards Australia becoming a knowledge society in the 21st century, and key competencies in a knowledge society are communication, literacy and education. And I think as this becomes increasingly the case that we're relying on intellectual capabilities and less on physical inputs and natural resources, we're going to have to advocate even harder for people with low language and low literacy abilities to make sure that they are included and can participate in a society that values so highly the areas that just aren't their strength. I want to start with some first principles about how children learn language. It is a remarkable thing that by the time children start school, they've already acquired many of the competencies that adults have, such as speech sound system and many aspects of grammar. Children are born ready to learn language anywhere spoken by anyone, and everyone has a theory about how children learn language. Children pick up language from their everyday interactions and experiences with their caregivers, and children don't have to be taught to talk in the same way that they have to be taught to read. Nevertheless, explicit teaching is the way that we can assist children who struggle to learn language without that additional support. Love and care, social interactions, shared activities and input from adults are essential, and Mark this morning talked about the 4 pillars of developmental parenting, all those pillars are really essential for language learning. Children don't learn language without these supports. But neurobiology, including genetics, is also essential, bearing in mind that children are born ready to learn language. And I think we certainly find that parents find it quite reassuring to learn about the neurobiological underpinnings of language impairment. Not that we understand them very well at this point, but an overemphasising the language learning environment can have some parents feel as if there was something wrong with the stimulation that they provided, when that really wasn't the case. So a balanced perspective is helpful, I think. Language growth, like many other aspects of development, is guided by clocks that regulate development from the moment of conception, and these clocks are both internal and external to the child. Internal clocks are set by the child's genes and regulate neurobiological maturation, and external clocks are set by society, and one of the really important ones children encounter is the age at which they have to start formal school. So why look for language patterns? Patterns are regular, repeated and predictable, and if this is true of language patterns, then it's relatively straightforward to fit policies and services to those patterns. We want to fit policies and services to developmental patterns, the who, and we want to fit policies and services to geographical patterns, the where. The children in our studies are recruited from the general population, and they're not children from selected populations such as specialist services, like many of you are working in, not culturally and linguistically diverse populations or communities with deep intergenerational disadvantage. So our patterns broadly fit children in the general population, but for this reason they may not fit the patterns that you observe, and I guess I ask that you bear with me in that, you know, our perspective is not everyone's perspective, but still one that hopefully is of interest and helpful. The children in the Looking at Language study that I'm going to talk about, and also the longitudinal study of Australian children, are recruited from birth records and Medicare records, and do rely on parents volunteering to take part in the study. For this reason, any population-based study will not represent fully families who are vulnerable, and different approaches are needed to hear the voices of those families. With the Australian Early Development Index, that is a national census of child development in the child's first year of school, and that does include a better representation of the general population than our studies that rely on volunteers. For our studies, we're not working with clinical diagnoses of language impairment. We're defining a language impairment as below age expectation. Sometimes that's one specific measure of one aspect of language, like receptive vocabulary, or a general measure of language development. So it certainly doesn't capture the functional aspects of the child's communication and the perspectives of the children in the families as we would do clinically. We investigate the influence of environmental factors on children's language acquisition using questionnaires, and we're working in these large population studies with quite a large set of child, maternal and family home environment variables. These are benchmarked against the Australian census and other Australian and international studies. We don't have direct observations of parent-child interaction, which is very important, and we believe that really the the best way to approach those more detailed studies is through a randomised control trial. We're actually looking at the impact of changing of the environment. That's going to be a much powerful test of those influences than an observational study. I'm going to discuss the discoveries one at a time, talk about the implications along the way, and then conclude with a summary of the results and the implications. The first discovery I want to talk about is that if we fit policies and services to geographical patterns, we'll miss most children with language impairment, and these results come from the Australian Early Development Index. This is a national measure of child development in their first year of formal school at 5 years of age. It's completed by teachers, and the results are reported for children who don't have a developmental disability. So this is identifying vulnerabilities in children who haven't previously been identified through any other service. It started in 2009 and the data are collected every 3 years. In this table you can see the clear social gradient in vulnerability on the language and cognitive skills scale in the AEDI. You can see that in the most disadvantaged quintile, 12% of children are vulnerable in language and cognition, compared to in the least disadvantaged quintile, 3% of children. Nevertheless, most of the children who are vulnerable in language and cognition are spread across all the quintiles. So we need to, I think, be thinking about universal language promotion opportunities for all children, and not putting all our resources into just particular geographical areas, because children with these vulnerabilities are located throughout many communities. I'm going to show you a couple of maps that show the geographical and developmental pattern mismatch a bit more clearly. These are maps of the Perth metropolitan area, and on the left-hand side of the map, your left, in red are the most disadvantaged communities in the Perth metro area, right through to blue, which are the least disadvantaged, and you can follow the path to the Indian Ocean and see where all the beachside suburbs are there, with that long line of blue down the coast there. On the right, that shows the areas, and again in red, it shows the areas in which 40 to 60% of the children in those areas were vulnerable in their language and cognitive skills in their first year of formal school. And what you see is that over and above socioeconomic disadvantage, there are lots of vulnerable children spread throughout the area. And what we would like to do, and it's one of the recommendations we made to the Senate inquiry, is overlay these maps with services to see where the services are a really important job to do for the whole of Australia. What to make of this? We believe that it adds to the case for services for everyone, delivered on a scale and with an intensity that's proportionate to the level of disadvantage. And we also need to know how to successfully implement universal services in communities experiencing deep and persistent disadvantage. And I've put up there the example of the Tasmanian Child and Family Centres model, which is one that I know most about. And this is the kind of community-based, community-led integrated service model that Tim Moore has spoken about several times at this conference before. Our second discovery was that early language delay doesn't foretell language impairment for many children, and the results for this come from the Looking at Language study. Had a large number of children at 2 years of age who met these criteria. Again, they were children who hadn't previously been identified with any developmental disability. Our measure of language delay was that they were 1 or more standard deviation below the mean on the ages and stages. We used our own approach to generate this cut point, not the test manual, and this is a parent report of expressive and receptive language abilities. High prevalence of early language delay, 13% based on expressive and receptive criteria, 20% based on expressive criteria alone, and this won't surprise anyone, 70% of the late talkers were boys. We were interested to find out the extent to which a late start foretold persistent language impairment, and we were able to follow up a group of the late talkers and a random sample of the children who had typical language development at 2. At 7 years of age, we did a lot of assessment, but I'm just reporting the results for a test of general language ability. We identified 4 patterns. Most of the children started on track and stayed on track. But this really surprised us. Of the children that started behind, 80% had caught up by age 7. But we also had evidence of persistent sort of risk conferred by early language delay, and we had 20% of children who started behind staying behind at 7. And then another a worrying pattern of children starting on track and then falling behind later on. If we put all our effort into early detection of language delay and language impairment, then we are going to miss children who start on track and later fall behind. And I think what's missing, and it was one of our recommendations to the Senate inquiry, is that we need to really devote considerable attention to developing cost-effective ways of identifying language impairment, and these need to be shared by the whole early childhood workforce, we think. We also need the kinds of supports that Mark talked about this morning, early language promotion, embedded in early childhood education and care, and delivered by the whole workforce. The next discovery was the gender pattern in early language delay didn't foretell the gender pattern we found at 7 years of age. You'll recall that 70% of the late talkers were boys. We didn't find any gender differences in language impairment at age 7, and this is not unusual in population samples. It's unusual in specialist services. If entry to specialist services is based on very early language delay, then most of the children in the service system are going to be boys and the girls will be underserviced. In our study, 51% of the 2-year-olds with early language delay had received speech pathology services, mostly boys. And again, we think this finding points to cost-effective detection of language impairment across the preschool and school years, not all the effort going into early identification, or we'll miss a lot of children, and particularly the girls. These patterns that I showed you earlier really made us curious about language growth. Children who start behind and catch up must go through a period of accelerated growth, and conversely, children who start on track and fall behind must go through a period of decelerated growth. And to look at growth in language, you need to have at least measures of language at 3 or more ages. And we were able to do this using data from the longitudinal study of Australian children. And what we found were some stable patterns in language development across those years. The test that we used at this age was the Peabody Picture vocabulary test, so a test of the words that children know. It's an aspect of language that grows throughout life and tracks strongly to literacy. You can see here we've got low starters in blue, kids in the middle in red and the high starters in green. And you can see the accelerated growth that the low starters have. Nevertheless, they still finish as a group below the children who were average or the high starters. This shows the same information but with the number of PPVT points that the children gained at each age. And you can see that the low starters, what we saw in the graph was that they gained 20 points. They gained more points than the high starters. Now, on this test, the high starters had room to move, so it wasn't as if they didn't have room to move, but there seemed to be like a natural kind of sort of, I suppose, a maturational kind of a mechanism that didn't have the high starters shooting off the scale. Nevertheless, starting positions certainly mattered, and you can see that the low starters, despite their higher growth, at age 8 finished in the same position that the high starters started. So put all these children of the same age in the same classroom, which is exactly what happens, and you can, yeah, they certainly don't start from an equitable developmental base in language. And I like this provocative quote from one of Ken Robinson's TED's talks. You know, students are educated in batches according to age, as if the most important thing they have in common is their date of manufacture, and you can see in this case that's certainly not true. I think he'd like that, like the data. Our fifth discovery was that language is also characterised by considerable change. Again, the same longitudinal study of Australian children data. That's what we saw before. If I lift the bonnet on these neat visualisations, this is what we get. Now, the children are stacked up neatly at age 4 because we put them there, in the bottom 15%, the middle and the top 15%. And why this visualisation becomes such a mess is that the children are changing position. You have a lot of the low starters moving into the middle or above, and then you have the others moving in the other direction. And this is actually all 4,000 plus children stacked one on top of the other, and where you've got the really, you can see that the real density is where you've got more children stacked, which is around the average lines which are shown there. We were really interested to see what caused those change patterns, and what we discovered was that a very large set of predictors explained very little. So this shown more neatly again with the red line showing, you know, the average growth, but you can see a lot of movement around the edges. We had 28 predictors in our model, child, maternal and family predictors, and modelled individually in relation to where children started at age 4, the factors that are in bold were the ones that were associated with lower language. So the variables were modelled as risk variables for lower language, and the least risk was the reference category, so normal birth weight compared to low birth weight, etc. When we adjusted the influence of all the predictors for all the other predictors, out of the 16, 10 remained significant, and you can see those there again a mix. And we think that the mix of child, maternal and family factors again points to that broad-based, multi-level kind of approach to support for children and families. Overall, from that large set of predictors, the few that remained significant in our model explained 7% of the variance in language at 4. This was quite a shock to us. By contrast, age explained a lot. Again, this is this visualisation shows the growth patterns that we're trying to explain. And age alone explained 53% of the variance in language, and the risk variables explained an additional 7. Now, there's still quite a bit of variation left there unexplained, we acknowledge that, but this really surprised it. The implication of this is that we're unlikely to be able to develop a kind of Framingham's risk equation type model for identifying risk factors for language impairment. The next discovery was also quite a surprise to us. Most risk factors for low language at age 4 were associated with higher, not lower growth, but I guess that explains that steeper slope that we saw for the low starters. I want to show you the effect of the 10 risk factors on language growth. You can see that children from non-English speaking backgrounds started at 4 years of age 16 months behind. By 8, they were 4 months behind, and the story with those children is by 10 they've caught up, if not exceeded, the other children. Children with low school readiness, not surprisingly, once they started school, that gap narrowed quite considerably. Children not read to at all were able to make some gains too, but still at age 8 were 7 months behind children who were read to every day. Children from large families, they gained a little bit of ground, but still there's a pervasive sort of effect over time there. Low family income, children gained ground. Low birth weight, children gained some ground, but that neurobiological influence was still there. Low maternal education, these children didn't lose ground, but they didn't gain ground, so they grew at the same rate as the other children, but they had to grow faster in order to catch up, so that stayed the same. Children whose mothers were experiencing mental health distress made some gains as well. Children with low parenting consistency, again the children gained ground. Children with high reactivity also gained a little bit of ground. This was the kicker. You may not remember from the slide before, but this wasn't high socioeconomic area disadvantage wasn't a risk factor at age 4, but by age 8, the impact of high area socioeconomic disadvantage left the children with an 8-month vocabulary lag. And what really struck us about this was to see how counter to overall development this is, what a pervasive and devastating risk factor this is, because of all the other risk factors more or less were associated with positive growth, and here we have one that's associated with negative growth, and it's all about the environment, not about the child's neurobiology. So just to sum up these patterns, starting position mattered. The gap between children with and without risks narrowed but didn't close completely. Already talked about socioeconomic disadvantage, the risk variables, and I want to make a final point here that the small effect sizes equated to noteworthy developmental differences, as you saw in the when I showed you how much. I suppose we have this statistical differences, but then translating that to lag in months of receptive vocabulary growth, there was certainly some sizable effects. The story so far has been about stability and change in children across the full range of abilities, from low to high. Now I want to talk about children with low language abilities. What we found was that low language at age 4 was a very limited predictor of low language at age 8, even when we included those risk factors in the model. When we modelled the prediction of low language at 2 through to 7, we thought that the fact that, that there wasn't much of a story there was because we measured language at first at 2, when language is highly variable. We were really surprised to find a similar pattern from 4 to 8. So to measure how accurate it was to predict from age 4 to age 8, we calculated the positive predictive value, which identified the proportion of children that we expected to be classified as having low language versus who actually ended up at 8 with low language. And the negative predictive value is the reverse, the children who the model didn't identify as ones who were likely to have low language at 8 and who actually didn't have low language. We predicted that a little over 1,000 children would have low language at 8, and of those, 26% did, and the model incorrectly predicted that just over 800 children would have low language at 8. So over-servicing, is an inevitable consequence. In terms of the negative predictive value, we did much better at predicting the children who were likely to be on track. The model still misclassified 6% of children, and that's a sizable number of children. So under both scenarios, over-servicing and under-servicing are going to be a fact of life. Again, the findings point to early language promotion that's broad-based, supporting children and families, delivered by the whole workforce, and detection of language impairment over time, not just in the preschool years. And not all the services geared up for early intervention. There needs to be something left in the system or something else in the system for children who fall behind later. The final part of the talk is how low language projects to low literacy at 10 years. And language to literacy patterns had a lot in common with the language to language patterns that I've described earlier. We had the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test at 4, 6 and 8, projected that to a teacher rating of language and literacy at age 10. The teacher rates the child on these competencies on a 5-point scale. We put language and literacy on the same scale and converted the scores to Z scores to retain the original relationship between the raw scores on the different tests. And I just want to show you what happened. Started with a large group of children at the beginning, most in the middle to high range of language, 318 who were low. At 6 years of age, this is what happened, and you can see we've got movement, here with quite a few children coming from the middle to high into the low range by 6. We see the same pattern here. Some stability, but mostly a story of change in both directions, low to high and then high to low. And then at 10 years of age, we end up with a similar proportion of children, but they are not the same children. It's why these longitudinal studies, as distinct from the cross-sectional studies, are so important. There we have that. I wanted to just point out 3 patterns that are really important. I think the first one, the good news story, most of the children start on track, stay on track. Look how rare the low, 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 low pattern is. 1% of children were low all the way through. Now, if this was more common, it would be much easier to identify and support these children. Isn't it interesting that that is much less common than the children who was on track in their language at 4, 6 and 8 and fell behind in their literacy? And there are 16 possible patterns that we have to try and fit our policies and services to, but they're the ones that I thought were of great interest. I think our contemporary definitions of language impairment are going to have to change to incorporate not just stability, which is what the main story has been, but also the notions of change, improvement and also decline over time. How well do policies and services fit the language patterns? I think the policies and services are set up more around the stable language patterns, early identification and identifying children for specialist services very young, which is very important, but there needs to be something left in the system for the children who fall behind later. So it's a challenge to fit policies and services to unpredictable, unstable patterns, and this is what we found. Over-servicing and under-servicing is inevitable. We think it's better to do the over-servicing, but do it in a way that's more cost-effective. So just to finish, we know that children move in and out of low language groups 2 to 10 years, and it's actually reassuring that language is robust for most children, but not all. We know that risks for low language change over time. Children grow into some risks and out of others, so it's going to be difficult to put that risk model together. And looking forward from any age, we really can't tell which children will stay the same, catch up or fall behind. And identifying children with low language at any one age will include children who eventually catch up and children who fall behind later. So we advocate for language promotion and intervention to span all the school years, not just the school year, the preschool years, that the whole of the children's workforce needs to be involved, as well as retaining the role of the specialist speech pathologist. We need a combination of the universal, targeted and specialist services across all ages. And school is our 12-year universal intervention, as we heard in the previous talk. So the school-based services that reach into the younger ages from birth to 5 are going to be very important. And 2 examples that I think are really worth noting are the Tasmanian Launching into Learning program and also the Tasmanian Child and Family Centre model. I think we can take a lesson from Finland. Finland's the highest ranking country on early childhood education quality indicators, and in Finland they apply a very light touch to identifying at-risk children and a very heavy hand to providing universal services of very high quality. Thank you very much.